Honestly, look at her. Some people are just content to be background characters in their own lives, happy to be invisible. The words, slick with the casual cruelty of privilege, sliced through the monotonous drone of the aircraft's cabin. The crowd of passengers in the immediate vicinity, those within the orbit of the loud man in the expensive suit, offered a nervous titter of laughter, a weak chorus of agreement for a sentiment they were too timid to voice, but secretly held. She didn't move. Her head didn't lift from the paperback she was reading, its spine broken and its pages softened by use. Her posture remained unchanged, a study in deliberate stillness, shoulders relaxed but spine straight, a quiet defiance in her very lack of reaction. The insult, meant to sting and diminish, simply dissipated against the shield of her calm, becoming just another ambient noise in the pressurized tube hurtling through the stratosphere. But a few rows back, in the anonymity of the rear cabin, an older man in a nondescript polo shirt, a man who had seen the world through a lens of threat assessment and calculated risk, saw not invisibility, but camouflage. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible way her eyes, while seemingly fixed on the page, scanned the reflection in the window, cataloging the cabin, noting the exits, observing the crew. When the older man, a federal air marshal on his final flight before retirement, saw the calloused knuckles on her left hand and the precise, economical way she turned a page, a flicker of recognition, a ghost of a memory from a classified briefing years ago, sent a cold, authoritative certainty through him. He didn't see a background character. He saw a guardian, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this flight was about to become anything but ordinary. If you believe that true strength doesn't need an audience and that competence is its own validation, type quiet professional in the comments below. The journey had begun like any other, a mundane tapestry of human experience woven at 37,000 feet. The air, tasting of recycled breath and faint disinfectant, circulated with a persistent hiss. Anya Sharma had chosen seat 22C for its strategic anonymity, an aisle seat in the rear third of the aircraft, offering a clear line of sight to the forward cabin and proximity to the rear galley and lavatories, a tactical crossroads disguised as inconvenient seating. She had settled into the familiar rhythm of long-haul travel, a state of suspended animation where the world shrinks to the confines of a single seat. Her focus was a shield, her book a piece of portable territory. But the piece was fragile, constantly eroded by the man in 22B, a Mr. Alastair Davies, whose existence seemed to be a performance for an unseen audience. His voice, a booming baritone honed in boardrooms, had been a constant sonic intrusion since takeoff. He spoke of acquisitions and mergers into his phone long after the cabin doors were closed, complained about the inadequacy of the wine selection, and treated the flight attendants with a thinly veiled condescension that marked him as a man accustomed to being served, not assisted. It was during his clumsy return from the lavatory, jostling her arm and causing her to drop her book, that the friction had finally sparked. She had simply looked at him, her gaze level and unervingly steady, and said nothing. It was her silence, her refusal to be flustered or intimidated, that had provoked him. He needed a reaction, an acknowledgement of his superior status, and her calm denial of it was an intolerable affront. So he had launched his verbal salvo, the insult about her being a background character, a dismissive judgment based on her simple gray hoodie, her worn jeans, and her profound lack of interest in his world. Some passengers had smirked. The flight attendant, weary from a long shift, had offered a weak, placating smile and moved on. Anya, however, simply retrieved her book, her movements fluid and unhurried. She didn't register the insult as a personal attack. She registered it as information. The man was arrogant, loud, and felt a need to assert dominance. He was a predictable variable, a known quantity. He was noise, what she was truly watching, what her senses were attuned to, with a primal focus honed in environments far less forgiving than a Boeing 777, were the three men who were trying so hard to be invisible themselves. One in 24D, one in 25G, and one further back in 31A. They didn't belong. It wasn't their clothes or their language. It was their stillness. It was a predator's stillness, an unnatural calm that stood out against the fidgeting, sleeping, screen-watching humanity around them. They were a chord of dissonance in the cabin's dull symphony, and Anya was the only one who seemed to hear the music. She continued to read her book, but the words on the page had long since ceased to register. She was reading the room, and the story it was telling was one of impending violence. The tension in the cabin began to coalesce, thickening the air like humidity before a storm. It started subtly, a shift in the atmosphere that only the hyper-aware would notice. The man in 24D rose, ostensibly to stretch his legs, but his movements were too deliberate, his gaze too sharp as it swept the cabin. He made brief, almost imperceptible eye contact with the man in 25G, a fractional nod that was a signal, a command. Anya's focus narrowed. The text in her book blurred into meaningless shapes. Her breathing remained even, a slow, controlled cadence that oxygenated her blood without betraying a hint of adrenaline. She placed her bookmark, a simple, stiff piece of cardstock, between the pages and closed the book, setting it carefully on her lap. Her hands rested on its cover, palms down, fingers relaxed but ready. To Mr. Davies, absorbed in a spreadsheet on his laptop, it was the gesture of someone settling in for a nap. To the observing air marshal, it was the posture of a coiled spring, energy held in perfect, disciplined reserve. The first move was a classic diversion. The man in 31A, the furthest back, suddenly cried out, clutching his chest and slumping forward in his seat. Passengers gasped. A flight attendant, her face a mask of trained concern, rushed toward him. It was the oldest trick in the book, designed to draw all eyes, all attention, to the rear of the plane. As heads turned, the other two men moved. They rose in unison, their motions synchronized and fluid. They were not amateurs. This was planned. The man from 24D moved forward toward the cockpit, his hand reaching inside his jacket. The man from 25G turned to face the cabin, his eyes cold and flat, a weapon of intimidation. He held up a small, dark object, not a firearm, but something that looked like a taser or a similar incapacitation device, and his voice cut through the rising panic. Nobody move. Stay in your seats. The carefully constructed bubble of civilization popped. Fear, raw and contagious, swept through the cabin in a wave of sharp intakes of breath and muffled cries. Mr. Davies froze, his face paling, his bravado evaporating into a cloud of pure terror. His world of spreadsheets and stock options had no protocol for this. He was no longer a player. He was a pawn, and his terror made him shrink in his seat, trying to become the very thing he had mocked Anya for being, invisible. But Anya Sharma was not invisible. She was simply waiting for the optimal moment, the precise intersection of opportunity and necessity. As the man from 25G focused his attention on the stunned passengers, his partner from 24D was making his way up the aisle, his path momentarily blocked by the beverage cart. That was the window. It was a gap of perhaps 3 seconds. To the terrified onlookers, it was an eternity of frozen horror. To Anya, it was a lifetime of operational planning condensed into a single, decisive thought process. Her movements were a symphony of brutal efficiency, devoid of any wasted energy. She didn't stand up in a dramatic flourish. She simply shifted her weight. Her right hand, which had been resting on her book, shot out and gripped the top of the seat in front of her. Her left hand snatched the hard plastic cover of her book. In a single, fluid motion, she propelled herself out of her seat and into the aisle, not toward the man threatening the cabin, but directly into the path of the man beside her, the one from 25G. He turned, surprised by the sudden movement from his periphery. It was his last coherent thought. Anya didn't use a flashy martial arts kick. She used physics. Her knee came up, not aimed at his groin, but at his thigh, striking the femoral nerve with a precise, debilitating impact that sent a shockwave of agony through his entire leg, causing it to buckle instantly. As he staggered, his focus broken, her left hand brought the edge of the hardcover book up in a short, vicious arc, striking him squarely across the bridge of his nose. The crunch of cartilage was sickeningly audible in the suddenly silent cabin. His head snapped back, his eyes rolling, and he collapsed backward, his taser-like device clattering uselessly to the floor. It had taken less than 2 seconds. Before the first man's body had even settled on the carpet, Anya was already moving toward the second threat. The man at the beverage cart who was now turning, his face a mask of fury and shock at the sudden, violent turn of events. He fumbled inside his jacket, trying to draw whatever weapon he had concealed. He never got the chance. Anya scooped up a discarded aluminum can from the cart as she passed it, her fingers crushing it slightly to create a harder edge. She closed the distance in 2 steps, her body low. He swung a clumsy fist at her. She moved under it, the punch sailing harmlessly over her head. Her left hand shot out, not to block but to hook his elbow, pulling him off balance and turning him. At the same time, her right hand, holding the crushed can, jabbed forward into the soft tissue of his throat, just below the jawline. It wasn't a knockout blow. It was a disabling one. He choked, gagging for air, his hands flying to his throat as his body was starved of oxygen. He stumbled back against the cart, which rolled and crashed into a row of seats, the sound of clattering plastic and metal unnaturally loud in the tomb-like quiet. The third man, the one who had faked the heart attack, was now on his feet, realizing the plan had catastrophically failed. He pulled a knife from his boot, a wicked-looking blade, and started moving up the aisle. The passenger screamed, a dam of fear finally breaking. But Anya was already there, between him and the rest of the plane. She held nothing in her hands now. She simply stood there, her breathing steady, her eyes locked on his. The silence that followed was absolute, a deafening void where the only sound was the hum of the engines and the frantic, ragged breathing of the would-be hijacker. The arrogance on Mr. Davies' face had been replaced by a pale, slack-jawed awe. He stared, unblinking, at the woman he had dismissed, the background character who had just dismantled a coordinated assault with the cold, terrifying precision of a machine. That's not possible, he whispered to no one. The words a faint puff of air, a testament to a worldview that had just been irrevocably shattered. The standoff in the aisle lasted only a moment, but it felt like an age. The third man, knife held low, faced Anya. He saw not a passenger, but an obstacle he could not comprehend. In her stillness, in the utter absence of fear in her eyes, he saw a threat far greater than the one he was trying to project. It was in that frozen moment that the Air Marshal, Agent Miller, finally moved. He had remained seated, his hand resting calmly inside his own jacket, his training screaming at him to intervene, but his instincts telling him to observe. He had seen professionals work before, but this was different. This was a level of fluid, instinctual violence he had only read about in after-action reports from Tier 1 units. Now, with 2 hostiles down and 1 contained, he rose, his sidearm drawn, but held discreetly at his side, pointed at the floor. "Drop it." Miller's voice was not a shout. It was a low, authoritative command that carried the weight of decades of federal service. It cut through the tension and gave the knife man a new target for his attention. The hijacker hesitated, his eyes darting between the armed man and the silent woman. It was the flicker of indecision Anya had been waiting for. She took 1 step forward, not aggressively, but deliberately. She spoke for the first time, her voice calm and even devoid of any emotion. "He's right. It's over." The sound of her voice, so unexpectedly serene, seemed to break the man's nerve. His shoulders slumped. The knife clattered to the floor. Immediately, 2 male flight attendants, their fear replaced by a surge of adrenaline, moved in to secure the man, using zip-tie restraints from the emergency kit. Miller moved past them, his weapon now safely holstered. He didn't check on the subdued hijackers. His eyes were on Anya. He saw the way she was already scanning the other passengers, her gaze assessing for shock or injury, her tactical mindset already transitioning to post-incident triage. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't breathing heavily. She was simply processing the next phase of the problem. Miller stopped in front of her. "Are you injured, ma'am?" he asked, his tone laced with a respect that bordered on reverence. Anya finally looked at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time. She gave a small shake of her head. No. She then noticed a small, dark red stain spreading on the sleeve of her gray hoodie, near the cuff. A superficial cut, likely from the second man's flailing. She looked at it with mild annoyance, as if it were a coffee spill. Miller saw it too. "Let me see that," he said, gently taking her arm. As he pushed up the sleeve to examine the cut, he saw it. Just below her wrist, partially obscured by the watch she wore, was a small, faded tattoo. It was a simple design, one that would be meaningless to 999% of the world, a small, stylized trident. Miller's breath caught in his throat. He had seen that symbol before, in the hallowed halls of Langley and in the redacted files of operations that had never officially happened. It was the mark of a very small, very exclusive, and very dangerous tribe. Agent Miller released her arm, his mind racing. The trident. The impossible efficiency. The absolute calm under pressure. The pieces didn't just fit. They locked together into a picture of undeniable, elite competence. He looked at her again, seeing her not as a female passenger, but as a weapon that had been temporarily sheathed in civilian clothing. He needed to confirm. He needed to be sure. He keyed the small radio on his belt, speaking into his wrist microphone. "Sirius, this is Watcher. We have a code for situation contained. I need a priority identity verification." He glanced at Anya's boarding pass, which had fallen to the floor near her seat. "Name is Sharma, Anya. Sharma." He then spoke a string of alphanumeric characters, his own authentication code. While he waited, he turned his attention to the cabin. The flight attendants were moving with renewed purpose, comforting passengers and checking for injuries. Mr. Davies was still staring, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions, terror, relief, and a dawning, profound shame. He watched as Anya knelt by the woman in the seat next to where the second man had fallen, a woman who was quietly weeping. Anya spoke to her in a low, soothing voice, her words inaudible, but their effect visible as the woman's sobs began to subside. She was a warrior one moment, a caregiver the next. A voice crackled in Miller's earpiece, tinny and distant. "Watcher, stand by." A few seconds passed. Then the voice returned, the tone having shifted from routine to one of distinct awe. "Watcher, be advised. Subject is confirmed. Sharma, Anya. Commander, United States Navy, retired. Last duty station. Naval Special Warfare Development Group." Miller closed his eyes for a second. "DevGru, SEAL Team 6. It wasn't just that she was a SEAL. She was from the elite of the elite, the unit that existed in the shadows, the tip of the spear. The trident was real." The voice in his ear continued, reading from a file that was likely flagged with more warnings than the nuclear codes. "Recipient of the Navy Cross, Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor Device, 3 Purple Hearts. Over 200 classified direct action missions. Considered one of the foremost experts in hand-to-hand combat and threat neutralization in the entire special operations community. Watcher, your subject is a goddamn legend." Miller opened his eyes and looked at Anya, who was now helping a flight attendant right the beverage cart. A legend. A quiet woman in a gray hoodie, reading a paperback in seat 22C. He walked over to Mr. Davies, whose laptop was still open, its screen displaying a meaningless chart of financial projections. Miller leaned down and spoke in a low, firm voice. "The woman you called a background character? She's the only reason anyone in this cabin is still alive. She has more courage, skill, and honor in one hand than you'll ever see in your entire life. You didn't see invisibility. You saw humility. You'd be wise to learn the difference with that." Miller walked back to Anya. He stood before her, and in the middle of the chaotic airplane aisle, surrounded by shocked passengers and subdued terrorists, the veteran air marshal did something he hadn't done in 30 years. He drew himself up to his full height and rendered a slow, formal salute. "Commander Sharma," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "on behalf of a grateful nation, thank you for your service." The story of Flight 734 became a quiet legend, spreading not like a wildfire, but like smoke seeping into the cracks of the aviation and military communities. On the ground, the official response was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. FBI agents swarmed the aircraft, whisking the three subdued men away into the anonymous world of federal custody. The passengers were deplaned and taken to a secure area for debriefing. Throughout the process, Anya remained a figure of profound calm. She gave her statement to the lead agent, her account of the events delivered in precise, technical language, devoid of embellishment or emotion. She referred to the hijackers as Hostile 1, Hostile 2, and Hostile 3. She described her actions not as heroic, but as the application of standard procedures for threat neutralization in a confined space. When asked why she, a civilian, had intervened, she gave a simple answer that left the seasoned agent speechless. "It was my duty." She refused all requests for interviews, deflected all praise, and her only expressed concern was for the well-being of the other passengers and crew. She asked for her book back, which had been taken as evidence, and when it was returned, she simply tucked it into her bag. The legend grew in the hushed conversations of the other passengers. They spoke of her silence, of the impossible speed of her movements, of the moment she had faced down a man with a knife, armed with nothing but her own indomitable will. The name they gave her was the Guardian of 22C. It started as a whisper in the debriefing rooms and became a hashtag on social media as passengers began to share their incredible story. They didn't know her name or her background, but they knew what they had seen. Competence so absolute it bordered on the supernatural. Mr. Alistair Davies was among the last to be interviewed. He was a changed man. The ordeal had stripped him of his arrogance, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of humility. He recounted his earlier behavior, his insults, his condescension, with a shame that was raw and palpable. "I judged her," he told the FBI agent, his voice cracking. "I looked at her, and I saw nothing. I was so wrong. I was looking at a giant, and I didn't even have the sense to be in awe." After the debriefings were complete, as passengers were being reunited with their families, Davies saw Anya standing alone, waiting for her ride. He approached her cautiously, his expensive suit now rumpled, his face etched with remorse. "Ma'am," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to say. I was an arrogant fool. What you did, I've never seen anything like it. Thank you. And I am so sorry for what I said." Anya looked at him, her expression unreadable. She gave a slight nod, an acknowledgement not of his apology, but of his transformed state. "Assumptions are a liability," she said, her voice neutral. "They get you killed, or they cause you to miss what's right in front of you." She then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Davies standing alone with her words, a lesson far more valuable than any he had ever learned in a boardroom. The ripples of Anya Sharma's actions spread far beyond the confines of the airport. Within weeks, the incident on Flight 734, heavily redacted and classified, became a mandatory case study at the Federal Air Marshal Service Training Academy in Atlantic City. Agent Miller, who had postponed his retirement, stood before a class of new recruits, a diagram of the Boeing 777's cabin on the screen behind him. "Look here," he said, pointing to seat 22C. "This is where the incident was resolved. Not by us, but by a retired naval officer who happened to be on board. The hostiles had a plan. They created a diversion. They moved on what they thought was a soft target. Their plan was good, but they made a fatal error. They made an assumption." He clicked to the next slide, which showed 3 blurred silhouettes representing the hijackers and 1 clear, sharp silhouette representing Anya. They assumed that the quiet woman reading a book was a sheep. They failed to recognize that among the flock there was a wolf, a sheepdog. Your job is not just to be a deterrent. Your job is to see. You must learn to see past the surface. You must recognize the subtle signs of a threat, but you must also learn to recognize the subtle signs of an asset. Look for the calm in the chaos. Look for the person who isn't panicking, the one who is observing, processing. That person might be your greatest ally. Her actions became the basis for a new training module called the 22C Protocol, focused on identifying and leveraging unexpected assets during an in-flight crisis. Her economy of motion, her use of improvised weapons, her immediate transition from combat to caregiving. It all became part of the curriculum. The legend solidified. Pilots and flight attendants spoke in hushed tones about the Guardian of 22C. They looked at their passenger manifests differently, wondering if another quiet professional might be sitting among them. The story became a modern myth, a reminder that the most formidable people are often the ones who feel no need to announce themselves. Alistair Davies, true to his word, underwent a profound change. He sold his shares in a predatory lending company and used the money to start a foundation that provided employment and mental health support for special operations veterans transitioning to civilian life. He never spoke publicly about the incident, but in a rare interview about his philanthropic work, he said, "I once met someone who showed me that a person's worth isn't measured by their volume or their visibility, but by their impact. I'm just trying to have a positive impact." He had learned the lesson Anya had taught him in that airplane aisle. True strength is not about asserting dominance, but about quiet service. A year later, in a small, quiet town nestled in the mountains of Colorado, Anya Sharma stood in a community workshop. The space smelled of sawdust and varnish. She was teaching a free class on woodworking to a small group of veterans, showing them how to carve and shape wood, how to find focus and peace in the methodical, patient work of their hands. Her gray hoodie was dusted with sawdust. Her hands, the same hands that had moved with such lethal precision on Flight 734, were now guiding another veteran's hand, showing him how to hold a chisel. She had no interest in the fame or the legend she had inadvertently created. The news reports, the social media buzz, the Guardian of 22C moniker, it was all just noise to her. Her war was over. Her service now took a different form, a quieter one. Her legacy was not in the stories told about her, but in the lives she continued to touch, far from the spotlight. She was teaching these wounded warriors a new kind of competence, a new way to be useful, a new way to find stillness in a world that was often too loud. One of the veterans, a young former Marine who had lost a leg in Afghanistan, looked up from the piece of wood he was working on. "Commander," he said, still using her old title out of habit and respect. "I heard a story about a woman on a plane. They say she was one of us. They say she saved everyone." Anya paused, wiping her hands on a rag. She looked at the young man, her eyes holding a deep well of understanding. She didn't confirm or deny the story. She simply picked up a piece of sandpaper. "There are stories everywhere," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the gentle scraping of wood. "What matters is the work. Focus on the work. Make something good with your hands. That's what lasts." She handed him the sandpaper, and in that simple, quiet gesture, she passed on the core of her philosophy. Legacy isn't a statue in a park or a name in a history book. It's the skill passed from one hand to another. It's the quiet competence that builds, that protects, that endures long after the noise has faded. True strength isn't what you say you are. It's what you do when you're needed. It's the silent promise kept in the face of chaos, to be the calm, to be the professional, to be the guardian sitting quietly in the background, ready. The lesson of the Guardian of 22C was not about the spectacular violence of a few seconds, but about the profound power of a lifetime of discipline. It became a parable taught to new flight crews, a story whispered in barracks, a reminder that assumptions are the enemy of safety, and prejudice is the enemy of survival. The empty seat, 22C, on that particular aircraft was never just a seat again. It became a symbol. It represented the potential that lies dormant in the unassuming, the strength hidden behind a quiet demeanor. It served as a constant question to all who knew the story. Who are you overlooking? Whose competence have you dismissed? The world is full of loud voices demanding attention, but the work of civilization, the task of holding back the chaos, is often done by the quiet professionals. They're the doctors who don't boast, the engineers who don't seek credit, the soldiers who serve in silence. They don't need validation because the successful completion of the mission is the only validation that matters. Anya Sharma never flew on that airline again. She had no desire to revisit the place where her two worlds, the violent past and the peaceful present, had collided. Her life remained one of quiet purpose, defined not by medals or headlines, but by the steady rhythm of helping others find their way. The legend belonged to the world, but her life belonged to her. The true measure of a hero is not the magnitude of the crisis they overcome, but the depth of the humility with which they walk away. It is the understanding that respect is not something to be demanded. It is the natural consequence of demonstrated competence. That day, at 37,000 feet, arrogance met reality, and prejudice was shattered by precision. A loud man learned that his status was meaningless, and a cabin full of people learned that their safety could rest in the hands of the person they least expected. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption and where professional discipline defines a hero's worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.